Hello, BookTube. Well, we continue on with Boldly Govember. That's a month-long read-along that was created by Matt at Paperback Junkie. It's all about Star Trek. In order to contribute to Boldly Govember, all you have to do in the month of November is read a Star Trek novel. Any Star Trek novel, just one, will be fine. I have been overdoing it by reading lots of Star Trek novels, and our progress through Star Trek fiction arrives now at the year 1987, when Paramount Studios tried something new. They created a new ongoing Star Trek live-action TV series for the first time in 30 years since the original show went off the air. There was all of a sudden a new Enterprise, Enterprise D. It took place 100 years after the time of Kirk and Spock and featured an entirely new crew. A new captain, new first officer, new technology, basically new ship. Federation's still around 100 years later, still going strong, still ruled by diplomats, still dedicated to peace. But the ship is much bigger, much more powerful, many more people on board, including families and children. There are hollow suites. The saucer section of the Enterprise can detach from the rest of the ship if need be. The first episode of the TV show, Encounter at Farpoint, intentionally linked itself to the original show with a guest appearance by DeForest Kelley, the actor who played Bones McCoy, who reprises his role as Dr. McCoy in that first episode for just a minute. Only McCoy is 137 years old. He's not a time travel episode. He's just around to see the Enterprise on her way. He has lived that long. He's lived to be 137 years old. And we see him in a wonderful winning scene with an android crew member, Data, talking about the Enterprise and cracking wise about Vulcans. And the little scene, it's no more than a minute, and it ends with McCoy telling Data, well, it's a good ship and a good crew, and if you treat her like a lady, she'll always bring you home. Which is a kind of odd thing for McCoy to say, since he's known that isn't true. He remembers that isn't true. No matter how well you treat her, sometimes she doesn't bring you home. He knows that better than anybody, because it was his captain that destroyed the original Enterprise. But once McCoy leaves, most of the sense of adventure and camaraderie and personality and interest that was such a defining characteristic of the original Star Trek leaves right with him on the same shuttlecraft. But it doesn't matter. We're not talking about the shows. We're talking about the novels. And of course, once there was a new Star Trek set 100 years in the future. So once again, we're dealing with time. Only now it's not a few years. Now it's not a few years down the line with our familiar command crew having advanced in their careers. Now it's 100 years in the future. And the 100 years in between, we don't know what's happened at all. The show originally makes a stab at mentioning that Kirk and Spock vanished. But that turns out not to be true, of course, because their fates will be written on the big screen, not the small screen, and not in an aside of exposition. But once there was a new show, there of course had to be new novels. By then, the novels were a viable source of income, a viable property in their own right. So there was a novelization of Encounter at Farpoint, and then you could expect to see, and you certainly did, a string of Star Trek The Next Generation novels. One thing that fans had noticed right away about the Enterprise D is that it was run like a corporation, with the captain as the CEO, rather than a dashing cowboy. Captain Jean-Luc Picard holds frequent staff meetings, and he himself is not lovable, and he himself is stern. You can easily see him issuing a by-the-numbers reprimand for someone not getting a form right or being 15 minutes late for their shift or whatnot. You can easily see him doing that, whereas it's very hard to see Kirk doing that. And unfortunately, if that is unavoidable as the ethos of your new show, I mean, you're trying to make it as adventure-oriented as the original, but you have the captain of your new Enterprise is sedate, he's bureaucratic, and he's 40 years older than the captain of the old Enterprise was. Not the type to do fistfights, not the type to go charging in where angels fear to tread, and not the same crew to follow him or challenge him or abrade him or be passionately dedicated to him. Instead, it all felt more like the Enterprise had become a ship of the line, and it might have been any ship that we dealt with. In fact, although none of them like to admit it once the convention money started rolling in, a couple of original cast members said in a couple of interviews when the show was just starting, I wish they'd made it some other ship. And William Shatner even went so far as to say, I don't have anything against the people or the technology or the special effects or the budget. I just wish they didn't call it Star Trek. Not everybody went that far, but a couple of the original stars of the show who then went on to make very nice with The Next Generation, especially if they got to appear on the show, in the early days, a couple of them said, well, it's fine. It can still be the Federation 100 years from now, but does it have to be the Enterprise? We did the Enterprise. Nevertheless, it was. And like I mentioned, once that wasn't a greenlit TV show, and nobody knew, but of course it went on for the full 7 years. It was a hit as a TV show, won all sorts of rewards, and I'm sure that it also won a doggedly loyal viewership. I'm sure that a lot of the people watching this are a part of that viewership. I'm sure that a lot of you have the Enterprise D as your Enterprise, your crew. And I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you look up to Captain Picard. That he was that in a formative time in your life, he was probably a very good role model. But I'm not talking about the show. I keep saying I'm not talking about the show. Instead, I'm talking about the novels that were spawned by the show, and there were quite a few of them. They won every month for a while there, and the draws of Star Trek fiction that we've been talking about on Boldly Govember have been twofold. One is the gimmickry. What new gimmick are you going to surprise me with here? Are you going to swap genders? You're going to swap identities? You're going to have holosuite character come alive, or a space leech, or something like that? That's one. Two is to see Star Trek done right. In other words, to see your characters in character. It's impossible to do that in the early days of the Star Trek: The Next Generation when you don't know the characters. You don't know what Riker is like. You have no idea if Wesley is even old enough to have a character. Data, by his very nature, cannot have a personality. And so on and so forth down the line. You don't know Worf's story at the beginning. You don't know Dr. Crusher's story at the beginning. You don't know enough, in other words, to come to those early Star Trek: The Next Generation novels and know whether or not the characters are in character or not, because the writers are making it up as they go along. They don't have much to go on. So I think it's fair to say that the first batch of those Next Generation novels isn't anything. It's not anything to write home about. They're boring on both fronts. Not only because the characters don't have anything in the way of, sweet spots that you're going to be thankful a writer hits, but also because any kind of technological gimmickry is being heavily watched now by the studio, who might want to use it for a live action show, and not therefore have you write a novel about it in which the crew faces pretty much the same thing. So you might think that what I'm going to say now is that it took the Next Generation time to start fielding good Star Trek novels. And since that's what this series is about, I thought that what we would do now is talk about the good Star Trek: The Next Generation novels that appeared in the whole course of the time when they were appearing regularly. And now that we're done with that, I'll wrap this up. But we'll talk about more Star Trek tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.